Hi, this is John Young again. Just wanted to say that interview with Krista and Neher was so terrific, we decided to break it into 2 episodes. And you're about to see the second half now. Hope you enjoy it. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it makes me think about like the role of the ad agencies or the PR firms, where a lot of that work has been traditionally in their realm, but now we've got, social media, we've got people inside organizations, we've got people outside. How do you see it impacting those kinds of companies? You mentioned before you've got a client who's an ad agency.
The whole agency model is changing anyways, right? Where you see a lot of big businesses are insourcing more. If you think about the trend towards agile marketing, and like these buzzwords kind of drive me crazy, but what it underscores is that businesses need to move faster based on data. And I think anyone could agree that that makes sense. And when you look at the traditional agency model, it's difficult to make that work and to get the responsiveness you need. I worked with a brand and we were analyzing their campaign performance. And there was a particular campaign they were putting all this money in. Subjectively, I would have suggested it didn't have a lot of best practices and was unlikely to perform well. Objectively, the data showed it was performing horribly, like horribly. And so we looked at it and did it was an analytics workshop I did with them. And we looked at it. So we had done a content optimization workshop first. So they knew that it probably had some problems. Then we did a measurement workshop. They're still running the same thing, right? So I'm like, why are you still doing this? We didn't talk about how bad it was, but we talked about what good content looks like. This is clearly not in that ballpark. 4 months later, we're analyzing it. Now we have data, but why are you doing it, right? One, we already spent our creative budget. So even if this is the worst thing in the world, we have no budget. But two, even if we took action, like let's say we left your workshop and immediately initiated the process, it would take us a month to get the extra budget. It would take us a month to get the agency briefing fully put together and approved. It would take the agency a month to come back with us with options. And then with lead times, it's 1 to 2 months for implementation. That speed does not work in this world. Agencies and big brands are both built on these ridiculously long timelines. And I think that whole model from a digital standpoint needs to be adapted. So how does this link to your actual original question? Is that agencies are not well suited to that responsiveness. And it's not because they don't have the skills or the interest or ability. It's like the whole way they work with brands, again, getting the budget, scoping it, so I think you see more brands in-housing a lot of this sort of content factory type of work where maybe the agency is going to do the initial creative or something, but the brands are insourcing it more and more.
Are you training any of your peoples on ways to conduct social intelligence or even just like competitive intelligence and benchmarking, to be more specific?
Yeah, we talk to businesses about this stuff a lot. And these are tricky areas I think why analytics and benchmarking is hard is because judgment has to come into play, right? Like I can say the average engagement rate is 2% and you're at 5. What the heck does that do for you, right? Or I say the average is 2% and you're at 1. Like, regardless, you ought to just be trying to do better all the time. So I think, but there's also judgment, right? Because, for example, I worked with a brand and I said to them, well, how do you think your Facebook ads perform? How would you rate your content? And I swear, everyone in the room, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10. I looked at it, I'd have given them a 2, but they all said 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, because they have a good agency that hypes up this stuff and makes them feel good about themselves. And I said, oh, cool, good starting point. What's your average view time on your Facebook video campaign that you just spent $1 million on? How long do people watch the video for? No one even knew. So first of all, you're giving yourself an 8 when you've never looked at any data that would support that this does well. How about that, right? Then on top of that, it was 1 second. Facebook will not tell you 0 seconds. 1 second is the lowest numerical view time you can have when you run a video. It's horrible. It's below industry averages. it's below internal for that company. Like this was the Middle East team, but you look globally, they have brands getting 5 seconds. But it's my judgment that can help them understand that their metrics are terrible, right? I could give them data, any data point I would give them in isolation. If I said, well, this is an industry benchmark, but we couldn't expect to get this, right? It's everything together and some judgment and experience in interpreting the data that is what helps bring it to life.
For some of these social projects, I know, especially in some of the industries that we work with, social media is starting to become more and more important to not just marketing, but the entire business. But the budget might not be there, or the buy-in might not be there from leadership. So are you teaching your students how to create buy-in around a specific social media project or objective? And if you are, could you kind of elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So I think, one of the things though that I think is worth pointing out when we think about social media data and intelligence is that ideally the impact is much larger than just informing your social strategy, right? Like I think the data we have available to us is so much bigger and more powerful than just being relegated into the digital department. And here's what I mean by that. I'm working with a big global medical company on some of their marketing. And one of the things that's really interesting is like they can see very clearly that the way they communicate doesn't resonate with people online because they can see how long someone visits their website, their engagement rate on their social posts. They have data in digital, right? But what we had the conversation around was like, do you think this is also true of your traditional media? Like, do you think anyone's reading all your brochures, or are they ending up in the garbage and getting glanced through, right? The insights we can get from social on how to communicate and what people want, that ought to be applied much more broadly than just social media. So I think specifically when it comes to something like that, like insights and selling that up the ladder, part of it is thinking about what is the true impact to the business from an actionability standpoint. And again, this is where insights and data are pointless if you don't have the propensity to act on them. The biggest point is driving that action, right? And so I think if you have a plan that has tangible, measurable action coming from it, that's something you can get buy-in from, right? And so I'm a very big data person, right? I'm big on numbers. I'm also big on being concrete about things because I see, especially in digital, people spin these webs just based on a whole bunch of fluff words, right? Like, oh, we're going to get analysis and blah, blah, blah. But it's like, okay, well, what does that do for me, right? And the reason decision makers don't decide is because often they cannot tangibly understand the impact.
I'm glad we're having this conversation. You're totally speaking our language. Wanted to see if you could shed some light on the top 3 campaign strategies for organic growth.
I mean, to be honest, the first thing I would say is augment organic with paid. So we're in a world where organic will only go so far. And I think sometimes when we think we separate it so much, we miss the bigger picture, right? Because look, if I create a piece of content that sells my stuff, right? That was the hard part. Paying an extra couple $100 or $5 or whatever the heck your budget is, it could be as low as $1, but paying a little bit of money for more people to see it, that should be a no-brainer. So the first thing I'll say is that if something works organically, there is absolutely no reason you shouldn't boost it with paid. And what's a weird kind of place we're in right now is that most businesses put a fair amount of time and effort into the creative. They rely only on organic, and then it doesn't get much reach. And I would argue their return on investment ends up being negative, right? If I spent 30 minutes creating a Facebook post and a custom image, I put it on Facebook, and let's say I have 10,000 fans on my page, chances are I'm only reaching 100 people. So I spent 30 minutes on creative that reached 100 people. That's probably not a very positive ROI when I look at my business impact at the end of the day. But if I added $10 to it, it could reach 3,000 people. Right? So I think we miss the big picture so often when we separate organic from paid in that way, because paid is like a no-brainer way to get more exposure. That being said, if someone is looking purely at organic, I think the biggest thing is coming up with that message that resonates with your audience. Look, the organic news feeds are only becoming more competitive. And Facebook is the most prominent at deprioritizing business content, right? So your reach is going to be under 1% as a page there on anything organic. Instagram still has decent reach. It's also on the decline though. LinkedIn has good reach, but it all comes down to the quality of your content and if it's connecting with your consumers. And I still think too much content from businesses, they kind of go on two ends of the spectrum. Either it's so business oriented that no one cares about it, right? Like no one cares what you're doing in your business. So it doesn't have enough consumer appeal. It's too focused, or it's all something funny or interesting, but doesn't drive somebody to act and go do business with you, right? So like, let's say a coffee shop, right? They could post a picture of a cup of coffee every day. At some point, that's not really speaking to anyone or saying anything. It's not going to drive any business. So I think it's finding that content sweet spot that's interesting for your audience and based on an insight about them, and then really bringing that to life in an interesting way. So I think that would be the second thing I would say. So one is paid, two, focus on an audience insight, and then three, optimize the heck out of your content. Everyone should take a copywriting class. Like everyone in the world should take a modern copywriting class, not like a college one, like something that shows you how to get to the point fast and use concise language and, and make something sound good, right? So many, I mean, I have a copywriting book, believe it or not, it's from 1984, and it has the best tips in it for modern writing even. One of the biggest things that I tell almost anyone I work with these days is I'm like, your sentences should be between 5 and 15 words long. And that's from this book from 1984. But especially online, people are scanning and you see these businesses. We're so excited to tell you that blah, blah, blah project that revolutionizes, like, holy cow, you have 2 seconds and no one gets anything in those 2 seconds. So I really think content optimization, it's the copy, it's the images, but you really need to use that spot wisely to create desirability, or no one is going to see your stuff based on social algorithms. So those would be the 3 things that I think matter most if you really want to do an organic social campaign these days.
What are some of the best ways to quickly do manual multi-channel research?
Got you. Well, I mean, you can sign up for a tool, right? Presumably like what you guys do. So, I mean, you can sign up for a service that's going to hold your hand and walk you through it. You can use free tools available. I mean, nothing stops you from going into Google Trends, using the Google keyword tool, et cetera. And that's a good starting point to unlock the data that's available and think about how you can use it as a part of your business, right? So like I worked with a food company, and as they were thinking of new products, like we would look at Google Trends to say, okay, if we think protein is a main benefit, let's look at is protein trending up or down in searches, because that just gives you an idea of do people seem interested in this, right? So use search data. You can anecdotally look at social data. You could use a social tool, right? And get even more data and insights around some of these trends. But I think there's a lot of simple free tools you can use. And then there's also paid options that are going to, to me, the paid options do more heavy lifting for you, right? And they save you time and kind of hold your hand through. But I think that, it's just getting out there. And where I think we're at now with this stuff is most people don't understand, one, the amount of data that's available, and two, what they potentially can do with it, right? So I worked on a data project with a company in Europe, and what the partner did was they pulled in for the Asian markets, they pulled in, I think they used search data or search quantity, right? So it's like the amount of people searching on different things. And they did all sorts of regression analysis over the last 5 years. And they were able to say confidently that search volume, and these were bigger brands, but that search volume was of branded terms was a proxy for market share. Right. So then these the brands, instead of running market share reports every other year, and it's backwards looking, they can get a real-time sense of how they're doing relative to competitors by analyzing search data. And it was validated that that relationship is true, right? I think oftentimes we assume what data can be used to tell us, right? Like people love engagement rates on Facebook. Engagement rates do not link to brand metrics. They don't link to better awareness, and they don't link to more favorability from a branding standpoint. So we got to be careful we don't misunderstand what the data says. But I think that's a great example where most businesses wouldn't even know that that data is out there. Is part one, so you got to know the data out there, but two, they wouldn't think to use it in that way. And those are the two things I think that people could be doing now to make better use of it. And nothing stops you from getting started down that journey.
Krista, Neher, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. It was fascinating. Like I said before, I think, you know, your expertise really does shine in your comments, and it's really helpful. And I'm sure our audience will appreciate some of those very specific tasks that they need to think about and ways to improve their work. This is John Young on behalf of Nichefire, along with Khalil El-Amin, the co-founder. Krista, thank you again for joining us. Krista Neher is the CEO and founder of Bootcamp Digital. Thanks again, Krista.
Thank you so much for having me.